Welcome to another episode of the Roundtable. And today we're going to be talking about how we're going to optimize recovery and how to use recovery strategies in order to maximize how much training we can get and build upon training in order to maximize our training outcomes. So, before we get into the nitty gritty, I think the biggest thing that we need to cover in terms of training is making sure, as coaches, or if you're self coached, that you're prescribing enough training for yourself that is recoverable. Because realistically, if we take it to an extreme example, I imagine if you're doing like 5 singles at RP 10 followed by 10 by 10, anyone can imagine like no matter what kind of modalities you're doing, it's just not going to be recoverable, right? So being able to understand that there's a certain amount of volume that you can prescribe yourself or be prescribed to get the work in, and you'll recover from that. And that's always going to be undulating, right? Like there's going to be periods of time where you don't need to be doing as much and you'll progress when you're in a favorable position or favorable recovery position, as well as in times of peaking and you're kind of accepting that you're going to be a bit more fatigued, that volume is going to be increased during those periods of time, right? I wanted to kick things off with starting with that. So I mentioned like an extreme example, right? But for us as coaches, from a programming perspective, when things start getting nitty gritty, how can we kind of find this balance between what's too much and what's like perfect? Leanne, did you want to start things off?
Yeah, sure. I guess it comes down to communicating with your athlete as well. So I guess, if they're reporting coming into certain sessions feeling more fatigued, then you're kind of looking at, how much volume they're doing across a week. I also find that like it depends on the size of the lifter. So I find that smaller lifters can usually tolerate more volume. But again, it's case by case. And like it's not, not everyone, say for example, not all small lifters are going to be able to tolerate high volumes. But it's just something that I've found kind of along the way. But yeah, from like a coach's perspective, kind of looking at the trends week to week, seeing, are they actually able to recover session to session and week to week, and looking at whether, they're actually able to develop like momentum throughout the block as the RPEs kind of increase.
Yeah. Did anyone else want to jump in with that as well?
I think
Oh, sorry.
the main thing I'll like look at when first working with an athlete is just like looking at how much they were doing previously, in terms of like a volume standpoint. So like looking at how many sets per week across squat, bench, and deadlift they have, and then just modeling their new program or their new block off that. So typically, we might look to increase volume very slightly when I first work with an athlete and see the response and see if there's a positive strength adaptation. Or on the flip side, if they're communicating that they're not recovering, then we can look to just return to that baseline of where they used to be and then optimize their training through, looking at the exposures and the intensity that they're working at.
Yeah, I think that kind of like leads into or touches into like, obviously for programming, we have the SBD movements and we have the accessory movements. So I think, we can accumulate fatigue across everything, right? Like we're accumulating fatigue through the SBD lifts. We're also accumulating it through any of the accessory movements that we're programming a client as well. So it's going to probably also depend on like where you're at in competition perspective. Like if you're probably out of a competition and like not in a direct peaking block, you can probably accumulate a little bit more fatigue, less on the SBD, more on the accessories, and then you can kind of flip the switch when it comes to like a peaking block as well. Especially if like, I guess for example, if you don't flip the switch, but an athlete is reporting that they're feeling more fatigued, is the accessory something we can pull from first and keep the SBD movements and that volume, total sets, total reps the same into a peaking block as well. And I think, that is just highly dependent on like leverages, somebody's efficiency in the movements, how they squat, how they deadlift, how they bench, and all those other like variables that we need to look at as well. If I use myself as an example, like for somebody who's quite a hingy squatter, I'm better off getting volume and work through and like an accessory movement that will help just load the quads versus trying to hit like 6 to 8 sets on a barbell squat and then like cooking myself for a deadlift later down the track, right? So I think there's like a number of things that we need to look at from like a coach's perspective. And it's always evolving and it's always changing. Sorry. So like, again, for myself, like when I first started learning sumo, I couldn't handle top end. So my volume was something that pushed my top end. Whereas now that I've gotten stronger and more efficient in the movement, and just I know how to choose load better, it's like my volume is probably the one that stays around this, certain percentage mark, but my top end's the one that's progressing now. So I think understanding that that's always sort of changing and evolving is really important too.
Yep. I just want to jump in real quick and touch upon what you just mentioned with like being able to select the right load. That plays a really key role, especially when we start doing like really high frequency, high volume, high specificity kind of movements, because you're stressing the same areas multiple times per week, right? So if you're kind of like overdosing essentially on a day where you're not meant to be, that's going to play into the next day. So I imagine, I'll give an example here. I've got a lifter who is currently like doing really well on his deadlift and it's been progressing. And when we switched it to the next block, it was like, okay, sweet, you're at this new baseline. I think you can start pushing your secondary day a little bit harder now, right? Because you're stronger. So you should be able to lift more. So naturally, we just started doing that. Secondary day starts progressing, and then this primary day starts to regress, right? So it's kind of like, okay, perhaps what we were doing is just doing enough to allow you to recover, and pretty much going into the primary day, you're going to stress your body as much as possible, but not as much as possible, but as much as necessary to elicit these gains, right? So it's not always about doing as much as you can. And at times it could end up being really submaximal and below threshold of what we consider to be, I guess, productive. Like when you do run this like high frequency kind of split where people are like squatting 3 times, deadlifting 2 times, you could do work that's like at RP4, RP5, and as long as it plays within the grand scheme of the plan, that's going to be productive work regardless. So I just wanted to add that in there as well. Cool. I guess then...
I think like with
Sorry,
that, it's kind of looking at...
Oh,
that's really quick. Just with that, it's like looking at RP as like a stimulus, not a load. So like your body doesn't know the load on the bar. It knows like the stimulus or how hard that set is. So like as you move through a block, if you're someone who can't handle, both a secondary and primary moving up at the same time, it would be a situation that, with that secondary day, you're just sticking more to RPE. If you have to take a dip in load, that's okay, because you're getting the same amount of stimulus, just with basically how hard the exertion level is or how hard the set is, not so much the load on the bar.
Yeah.
is Danny
You know
lag?
what I'm saying?
Oh, sorry, guys.
No.
I was going to say that being said, assuming that programming is covered, right? And that is a very big assumption, but assuming that is covered, recovery is another aspect that if you can dial the lever and really leverage and take advantage of, that's how you really compound the gains and essentially move from someone who's like an intermediate lifter into an advanced lifter, right? It's almost like an equal equation on both ends. You need to start looking after both. So this conversation is going to be covering more so the habits that you can kind of build upon. So the main pillars that we're going to cover today were going to be nutrition, sleep, and stress. So in a previous episode with Shania, she covered nutrition really well, but I kind of just wanted to build like this hierarchy of like things that you can start really nailing down before you start moving on to things, right? So for an example, like making sure that you're hitting your macronutrient targets on a day-to-day basis. And once you can start covering that, then you can start looking into like optimizing nutrient timing, supplements, things like that. So Shania, you're a nutrition coach, so I mean, like, balls in your court. What's the kind of like grand scheme or hierarchy that you see in your head to kind of instill these good habits?
Yeah, I would say like the first one and the overarching one is just like macronutrient, like hit your calories, like get calories in, calories out kind of perspective. Like that's the really broad one. Like I think, for a lot of lifters who first start working or prioritizing their nutrition is really just about like, okay, your calories, how consistent are you day to day, week to week? Like rather than, you know, for example, someone having like 3,000 calories on one day and then the next day they're only having like 1,500. It's like that large variance is something that is going to play a role and change how you're feeling day to day alone. And then the most simple one is also just like maintaining consistency over the weekend, because a lot of people just fall off the bandwagon. You know, it's like we either sleep in later, we don't have the same routine from like as we do as on Monday to Friday. So that would be the first one, like macronutrients is the overarching. The second one would then lead into like your micronutrients. So like being more, I guess, like looking at like fiber, like other sort of variables of micros, like, you know, potentially like a few stops being like, you know, your vitamins, blah, blah, blah. The third one would then probably lead into like meal timing, frequency, that sort of periodization. And then like the smallest one would be like stops outside of that. So like caffeine, your pre-workout, like from like a nutrition sense. So that would be like the hierarchy that I would say that I kind of like lead with my clients.
Yeah. And I guess it's pretty obviously like some people can fall into a pitfall where they would start over prioritizing, I guess, the minors, right? Like people major in the minors. And I guess you could see people who, and I guess we have this culture where people overly rely on caffeine, right? Like there's so many caffeine products out there that you just rely on that as your source of training stimulus motivation. Sam's getting called out real hard right now.
Yeah. It's just like caffeine is like a vicious cycle, right? Because it's like your caffeine, depending what time you're training, how much you're having, and like how it affects you individually. It's like you have it because you're tired, but then like you have so much that you then don't sleep that same night. And then it's just like this vicious cycle of like, you don't sleep, you have more caffeine. You don't sleep, you have more caffeine. You don't sleep, you have more caffeine. And it's just like, it never ends well. I think that people prioritize, as you said, like they major in the minors from a sense of they put all of their recovery hats and buckets in one thing. So they either think that it's like, it's only sleeping, or it's only doing this, or it's only sitting down and resting. It's only hitting my macros. It's not like recovery is everything. Recovery is not just one thing over the other. It's like you need to be prioritizing your nutrition. You need to be prioritizing your meal timing. You need to prioritize, you know, your sleep. You need to prioritize neat activity outside of your training. You need to prioritize hydration, like everything. And I think layering on those as you become more advanced in the sport, or as, you know, if the sport becomes more of a priority that you want to see progression, is really important. Like not trying to go from 0 to 100, obviously, but layering it on until you feel the effects of how everything just comes together and makes you feel better as a whole, kind of session to session, week to week, you know, year to year, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And like you said, like this is a hierarchy of behaviors, right? Like you can only start building those behaviors on top of each other once you've set the foundation. You can't really have sustainable, perfect, like macronutrient spread that's timed correctly if you can't have your macros on one day and repeat that in like across 2 days, right? So it's really important that acknowledging where you're at in terms of how you're currently operating in terms of behaviors, and then trying to implement things a bit at a time and giving it time. It's essentially like progressive overload, but like behaviors, right?
Yeah.
So I think that covered nutrition quite well. If you haven't already listened to the episode where we covered nutrition, that'll cover things in a lot more depth. You touched upon sleep, Shania, which is another, I guess, like relationship between caffeine, sleep. But sleep is another really core component that I think needs to get addressed pretty much on point as much as nutrition, right? So Dave, did you want to jump in and explain, I guess, your understanding of how you can kind of build this habit of like good sleep in a way that works for athletes?
Sure. So I guess we'll start with like, I guess the importance of sleep. So obviously everyone knows how important it is to get your sleep in. And then based on, I guess, your training, you obviously need more sleep. So I'm not sure if you've ever seen that table where it's like your general population person needs like 6 to 7 hours, you know, medium activity, 7 to 8. And then it's got like the elite athlete section, which is like 8 to 9 hours. So obviously the harder you're training, the more you're doing, the more sort of recovery you'll need, and the more like you can, I guess, benefit from sleep. The other cool thing as well is that from like an injury risk perspective, I know there's been studies that have come out recently that have shown that if you sleep more, you'll have less likelihood of getting injured as well, which is actually really, really cool. So there's that, which isn't exactly related to performance, but it also is, because if you can stay injury-free for longer, you're going to string together more productive blocks time after time, and obviously make more progression there. As far as sleep habits go, there's a bunch of things you can do. Like there's a bunch of sleep hygiene stuff, like not being on your phone or not being like really heavily stimulated before you go to bed. There's things you can do like staying off electronics inside your room and making that like a place of rest and a place of sleep. So keeping technology out of there. Finding ways for you to wind down as well. If you are someone that uses a lot of caffeine and you find yourself pretty amped up when you get home, or you just train late and you come back and you're all sort of excited from training, finding ways to like wind down and relax and learn to switch off can be really, really helpful. Whether that's like meditation or like, things like that, playing with your dog, reading a book, finding ways to just relax and calm down so you can go to sleep and become rested. And then it's sort of like nutrition in a way where if you create a schedule or a routine of like, I eat breakfast when I first wake up, I eat lunch at 12, I eat dinner at 6 or whatever. If you can create a routine and a habit of when you go to bed and when you wake up, it's much easier to fall into a pattern of, okay, it's 9:30 or 10 o'clock and I'm tired now, I'm going to go to bed. And then that way everything's consistent. You're getting the same sleep each week. You're not doing the whole like 3,000 calories, 1,500 calories, or 9 hours, 5 hours kind of thing. So routine and pattern can be really, really helpful from that perspective as well.
Yeah, I think the common pitfalls that happen with sleep isn't so much the sleep itself, because that's not something that we're necessarily in control of, right? But setting up the environment to make sure that sleep does occur is probably the biggest key, right? So you mentioned routine is probably a very big factor in terms of sleep. And as humans, we follow this circadian rhythm, right? It's like the more regular your sleep pattern becomes, the more energy you're going to have in the morning, as well as the easier it is for you to sleep at nighttime, right? So I think there's a lot of things that we could unpack here with sleep that affects it. We mentioned before, like in terms of training volume and recovery and things like that, it's pretty natural for when we start to turn the dial up on training that our sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for like fight or flight or like actual training performance, we could think of that as like one side of a seesaw where that starts to get pushed down. And if that stays on, we can't switch off, like Dave said, and then that'll affect sleep, right? So I think the biggest thing when we do look at sleep is trying to find ways, I guess, to relax, because that's the biggest relaxant, right? Like if you're sleeping, you're able to relax. And that's like Dave said, like meditation, playing with your dogs, reading a book. The common theme between all those are activities that allow you to relax.
Yeah,
So,
I would even just like touch on
yeah.
or add and say like it's the same again, like David said, the same as nutrition, where like obviously in that podcast last week where we spoke about nutrition, or the week before, sorry, it's like people I think don't think about sleep until it's like they're 2 weeks out and they're noticing that sleep is decreasing, right? So if you don't have all these habits and routines that you've figured out and put in place in like your off season, the same as like off season with nutrition, it's like it doesn't really matter if you like come into the last 2 weeks of your prep and you're like, now I'm going to get 10 hours of sleep. Like it's kind of like too late for that. So it's like creating the changes when you can outside of that, so that when it actually comes to, you're peaking for a comp, you're 2 weeks out, you're noticing that sleep is maybe going to start dropping off from like how your body's feeling. It's like all of these routines that you have in place are going to help you to be able to like carry on the 10 hours of sleep and maintain it, rather than go from only having like 6-7 hours of sleep to then trying to get 10, because then it's just kind of like more stress. You're stressed about comp, you're tired, you're sore, you're not sleeping. You said that last night, Danny, where like you're stressing about not sleeping, so you're not sleeping more. It's like do all of this beforehand, and then it'll just help. You'll be able to carry that into comp.
Yeah. And I think like to add to that, you mentioned like if you're already sleeping 10 hours, it's likely that when you do start this peaking phase and everything like that, sleep's going to drop off, right? So you at most might be able to get 8 to 9 hours of sleep. Now imagine the person is like sleeping 4 hours because they're distracted on their phone and they try to get it. Like you said, that routine's just not there. You're probably going to be staying at 4 hours, if not maybe even less, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the most crucial times when recovery is important. So sleep is one where it needs to be, where it's like biologically habitual. It needs to be something that if your like lifestyle allows you to mold around it, then it is a key. It's something huge that needs to be covered. And I mean, like, it's unfortunate that some people do have like shift work and things like that, but that's another topic.
Yeah.
I think to extend on that, like when you're in a peak, you want to be watching like all your training videos from the day. But I think that's something that can be really helpful is like don't watch your videos from that day just before you go to sleep because it's like it just hypes you up. And it's like you're hyped up before you go to bed. And it's just not ideal. So that's something that I found that is really
It's the
helpful.
best
It's just
part.
yeah, but
Yeah,
there's
I
got to
do
be
the same.
balance. Yeah.
I do the
The
same.
only other thing I'm gonna add, which Sam, I mean, anyone at Perf will know I'm very controversial on this topic, but the athletes have like the good old Whoop data that they like to read and look at. Now I'm not gonna bash the Whoop. I think it's great from like an athlete level, depending what level you're at. But I think again, it's like it's a piece of data that needs to be able to be viewed objectively. And I think that it should be the last piece of the puzzle. Like I think if you are controlling everything that you can control and you're like from like a background perspective, you know, you're trying to make things better, you're trying to improve your sleep quality, you know, by putting in like the habits and the routines that David said earlier, like all the little things, having a Whoop that's there to then like tell you like from an objective data sense, you know, that recovery, what your HRV is, how much actual sleep you got, time in bed, you know, the green, yellow, red in terms of like your recoverability. I think it's great both from a nutrition and a powerlifting coach perspective. But I would also like my big take on it is like tick the boxes first and then get it. Like don't get the Whoop hoping that it's going to fix you magically.
Yeah, I agree with that. Go, Sam.
My take.
I object.
No, just because we're talking about it. I think the biggest thing with the Whoop that's helped me is kind of like over the past how many months wearing it, or most of the year, is like getting a baseline of how much sleep I get based off how long I'm in bed for. So like I know if like I'm in bed for 9 hours, I'm getting roughly about 7.5 hours of actual sleep. So now if like for me, I have this like baseline where like ideally I want to be in bed for 9 hours because I know I'll get, you know, X amount of hours of actual sleep. And then that's what makes me generally recover pretty consistently throughout a training week and block. So in terms of like a consistent sleep, you know, wake time, that's helped me a lot with the Whoop. And I think with the Whoop as well, like, again, you've got to have everything in check first. I've found over the past like 10 weeks being a lot more consistent with nutrition, steps, water, everything else. My Whoop scores are actually a lot more like reflective of how much I'm putting work into my recovery. Like I've got like consistent streaks of green, whereas previously, you know, when my nutrition quality wasn't as good, I wasn't hitting macros consistently, I wasn't sleeping very consistently, there would be these big swings of like yellow, then red, then green, then yellow, then red. Whereas for the most part, over the past 10 weeks, really dialing down on all these like baseline, you know, habits, the Whoop's showing up green, baby. I'm streaking green every day. I'm feeling good. So that's my 2 cents. Yes, you got to have everything set in first, and you got to take it with a pinch of salt.
Well, having everything like on track for you, Sam, like specifically, like it's helped you become more objective with it. Like, whereas like prior to the 10 weeks, like prior to like nailing everything, it was more of that feeling of like you would feel good, but then your Whoop's telling you you're red. And then you're like, well, I feel good. So why is it telling me that I'm like in the red? Right. So I think it's that same with anything, right? Same with like following a program and like following progressive overload. It's like when you're controlling all the variables and you know that you're ticking off all the boxes, you're able to be more objective with whatever the data reading is telling you.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was like the most obvious in the last few weeks where I had like that big streak of green, and then over the weekend I was like yellow and red and yellow, and I was actually tired and feeling like shit.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, yes, I've got everything in check. Training stress is really high. I'm literally just fatigued.
Yeah. And I think to tie things off with that as well, like you mentioned, training stress and I wanted to bring in external stress as well. So for the body, stress is stress, right? And there's a couple of ways we could kind of go about it. You've got acute stress and you've got chronic stress. I think when we go down this rabbit hole, I think as humans, naturally, we're resilient against like acute stresses, right? So if something happens like in a short period of time, you're able to react to it, and the body's actually very good at being able to handle tasks. So for example, like a training session, right? So you can show up, you'll do your session, you'll recover, and next time you do it, you're going to be able to recover, right? But the problem lies in when things don't drop off and there's this chronic stress that's happening. So and that's not separable from training and life. Life is training and training is life, right? So when you are managing training load, work stress is up, or uni or relationships, that needs to be acknowledged and I guess reflective in your training, right? So that's when it's important to look back at programming as well and having tools that you can kind of manipulate, because training is this variable that you can control. For the most part, like externals are essentially uncontrollable. You can't really control what happens at work. You can't really control what happens in a relationship to an extent, right? So I think my take on handling external stress is, for most people, because it's uncontrollable, you need to have the tools in place to be able to manage your training load, and also manage expectations, because stress is stress at the end of the day. Did anyone have any?
I think everyone like obviously responds differently, right? Like I think like my take on it is that like even just like my experience on it is there's I guess people who respond to stress with like throwing their all into training. So it's almost like they're able to create or like compartmentalize where they turn off that stress, they just give it their all in training. It's like their outlet, they get relief from it. Whereas it's like there's also people who like stress affects their training a lot. And it either comes to the point where they can't train or like they are having to auto regulate or take load off. So I would say like as a coach, you know, because you can't plan stress, right? Like it just comes out of nowhere. So it's like when working with clients, it's like I usually will let the first one and just like be there as more of a support model. Like if I don't know how they respond to it, I usually just like communicate, like auto regulate, adjust as you need to, you know, like take it as it goes, you know, session to session, day to day. And then I see what they do. Like I see whether they're the athlete who will continue to try and push and either put equal or more load on the bar, or if they're an athlete who will naturally just take load off and like adjust accordingly. And then that kind of obviously gives me that data point and that information on where we go next. So then it's like if a next stressful period comes up, you know, within their life, and depending how they responded the first time, that gives me the info on how I need to support them. So if it's like, you know, if they're an athlete who naturally auto-regulated, I'll either just adjust the RP and help them auto-regulate more, or if they're the athlete who like tried to put more load on the bar and just like cook themselves more, I'll go to like prescribing load. So, and then just like obviously supporting and communicating external and outside of just like a programming sense too.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up some kind of like common situation, not common, but like, I guess situations that might occur where I guess auto-regulation might not be enough and there's going to have to be some sort of change to the program, right? So like first one that I think of is like having a newborn baby in the family, right? Like that's going to affect all sorts of things. You got sleep, nutrition, and those two are also going to affect your training. So from a programming perspective, when you look at it from that perspective, like there's very slim chance of you repeating the same program, purely because of recovery standpoint. Like you're going to have to reduce the training stress because, like we said, stress as a whole is just much greater. That's not related to training, right? What else do you have? I mean, you could imagine like losing a job, right? All these periods, and I guess it keeps going full circle to like chronic stress and being able to have strategies to be able to manage that. So for some, and I guess like you said, Chana, like for some people, being able to compartmentalize and have training as like that form of therapy or some place that you can go to, I think that's where people respond best in terms of that situation when stress is high. But for, I guess, people that already have this like fixation on training and have high expectations and you see this number start to drop, I think it's important to have some sort of, not resilience, but I guess mental strategies or being able to acknowledge why or rationalize why the numbers are happening, right? Because it's not, I guess, how would I say it? It's not something that happens to you personally, and it's not your fault that you're going through stress, right? But at the end of the day, it needs to be acknowledged that it's happening so that you can get through this period. And then when you come out of it, that's when the performance can start to shine, right? I think that's a educational or supportive piece that I tend to explain to people that go through those high periods. We're not always looking to be high performing or expect linear progress, even through difficult periods. It's being able to manage the downside of these periods so that when you come out of it, you're in a better position.
Yeah, I think as well, like it's okay to go through those sorts of periods, like especially exam people who are in like an exam period, and then they start to kind of get more stressed, and then training starts to go down, and then they freak out, and it's like it's okay, like you're going through this, but you're gonna get through it, and there's gonna be up phases, down phases. Like it's not always going to be linear progress. So yeah, it's just being okay with that.
Yeah. All right. I think we'll tie things off here, but just to recap, at the end of the day, training stress and life stress is going to be the same on the body. So we need to always manage our training stress. That's something that we do have in our control at all times. But other things that you can always leverage pretty much year round is always going to be nutrition, sleep. And if you are able to have these strategies around stress, that's always going to be very helpful too. Yeah. Thanks guys for listening to another episode of the Roundtable, and we'll see you in the next episode.